Welcome to my BNB Glow channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Will knelt down before Electra, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst through his chest, the weight of his secret pressing down like a mountain he could no longer carry, and with his eyes lowered, his voice trembling as though dragged from the deepest corner of his soul, he whispered the 5 words that shattered the stillness of the room. I slept with a woman that night, and instantly the air seemed to freeze around them, Electra's face paling as though all the blood had been drained from her veins, her breath caught in her throat, her fingers stiffening at her sides as she tried to comprehend the confession that felt more like a dagger driven straight into her heart, for she had suspected lies, she had felt shadows lurking in his silence, but she had never been ready to hear it spoken, not with such raw finality, not from the lips of the man she had trusted with every beat of her being. And as Will's words lingered in the silence, echoing like a curse that could not be undone, the fragile glass of their love shattered with invisible shards that cut both of them, and yet neither moved, neither breathed, for the room itself seemed suspended in grief, in betrayal, in the agonizing recognition that nothing would ever be the same again, and Will, on his knees, could not lift his gaze to her eyes, because he knew if he saw the pain he had inflicted, he might never forgive himself, though forgiveness was the last thing he deserved, the last thing he expected. But still, he had to tell her, he had to pull the poison out no matter how much it destroyed them, because living in deceit had already hollowed him out until he was barely human, and so he stayed there, trembling, waiting for her words, her reaction, anything to release the unbearable silence, while Electra, standing so still she seemed carved from stone, fought against the storm erupting inside her, memories of their laughter, their intimacy, their whispered promises colliding violently with the image of another woman, faceless yet suffocatingly real, sharing what she thought belonged only to her, and her chest rose and fell with sharp, uneven breaths, her eyes burning but refusing to weep, because tears felt like surrender and she would not let him see her broken, not yet, though her heart had already cracked in 1,000 invisible ways, and still, somewhere beneath the shock, beneath the searing anger clawing at her insides, there was a voice, quiet but insistent, demanding to know why, demanding to understand the story behind the confession, for betrayal without explanation was unbearable, and so at last, with a voice colder than ice, she asked, when? Why? And Will flinched, the words slicing through him like a whip, forcing him to raise his eyes just enough to see the devastation in hers, devastation he had caused, devastation that made him loathe himself more than ever, and he swallowed hard, his throat dry, his body trembling, before he began to speak, unraveling the tangled, ugly truth that had led him to this moment of destruction, telling her how weakness had overtaken him, how guilt had festered inside him, how that night, oh God. That night, he had been lost, consumed by despair, by doubts he had never voiced, by loneliness he had been too proud to confess, and into that darkness had stepped temptation, not with love, not with meaning, but with the illusion of comfort, with the lie of escape, and he had taken it, knowing even then that it would ruin him, that it would stain everything he had built with her, but still he had given in, and afterward he had carried the weight like a stone around his neck, drowning quietly, while trying to pretend he could still breathe, until tonight, when the silence became unbearable, when he could no longer look into her eyes without hearing the lie between them, and so he confessed, not because he wanted redemption, but because he could no longer let her live with a man who was hiding something so poisonous, and his voice cracked as he begged her to believe that it had never been love, it had never been about anyone else, it had been a mistake, a moment of weakness that had haunted him every day since, but Electra's face remained unreadable, her heart warring between fury and grief, between the urge to scream and the desperate desire to erase what she had just heard, and still she said nothing, for words felt inadequate, words felt like dust compared to the earthquake that had torn her world apart, and Will, seeing her silence as worse than any anger, worse than any slap, reached for her hand, desperate for some connection, but she stepped back, and the gesture cut him deeper than any blow, for in that single movement she had told him everything, her trust was gone, her love was wounded beyond recognition, and the future they had dreamed together now lay in ruins at their feet, and yet, despite the devastation, despite the unbearable truth, neither of them moved to leave, for love, even broken love, has roots that run deep, and even as betrayal burns, the soul hesitates to sever what once gave it life, and so they stood there, bound by pain, drowning. In silence, staring at each other through a haze of loss, knowing that from this moment on, nothing would ever be simple again. The oppressive silence of the mansion after the gala's final guest had departed was a physical weight, a thick, velvety gloom that seemed to absorb sound and hope in equal measure. Will stood by the grand piano, his fingers tracing the cool, polished wood without truly feeling it, each tick of the ornate clock on the mantelpiece a hammer blow against his temples. The ghost of her perfume still lingered in the air, a devastatingly expensive and subtle fragrance of night-blooming jasmine and sandalwood that now felt less like an aroma and more like an accusation, a scent that had woven itself into the very fabric of his being over the past few hours, a sensory tattoo he knew he would never be rid of. He had tried to rationalize it, to compartmentalize the evening into a series of understandable, almost inevitable moments, the heady mix of champagne and flattery, the intoxicating thrill of being seen not as Electra's accessory but as a man of his own merit, the vulnerability in the stranger's eyes that mirrored a loneliness he dared not name within himself, but the excuses crumbled to dust before they even fully formed in his mind. They were ashes in his mouth. The simple, brutal, unadorned truth was a stone in his gut: I slept with a woman that night. The sentence looped in his mind, not in his own voice, but in a flat, judicial tone, a verdict handed down from a higher court of his own conscience. It was not an act of passion, nor was it one of calculated malice. It was a catastrophic failure of the soul, a momentary surrender to a weaker version of himself he had believed long buried, and the aftermath was a desolation more complete than any he had ever known. He looked at his reflection in the dark window pane and saw a stranger, a man with shadowed eyes and a mouth set in a line of profound shame, a man who had willingly shattered the one truly beautiful thing in his life for a fleeting, worthless warmth. He knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and absolute, that there was only one path forward, one impossible, necessary thing to do. To hide it, to bury it beneath layers of deceit and forced normalcy, would be a second, greater betrayal. It would poison the very air they breathed, turn every tender glance into a potential interrogation, every moment of happiness into a fragile facade. He would become a curator of a lie, and the museum of their life would be a monument to his cowardice. He had to go to her. He had to offer up the truth, this wretched, ugly thing, and place it at her feet, knowing it would likely destroy everything. It was the only form of penance available to him, the only action that contained a shred of honor. His legs, heavy as lead, carried him through the silent house, up the sweeping staircase that felt more like a climb to the gallows. The door to her sitting room was ajar, a sliver of warm, soft light cutting through the dark hallway. He pushed it open, the sound of the hinges a quiet groan that seemed to echo his own inner torment. Electra was there, still dressed in the elegant emerald gown she had worn hours earlier, though she had removed her jewelry. She was standing by the fireplace, one arm wrapped around herself, the other holding a glass of water she wasn't drinking. She looked ethereal in the firelight, her profile serene, but Will could see the tension in the line of her shoulder, the slight tremor in her hand. She had sensed it, he realized with a fresh wave of agony. She had felt the tectonic shift in the universe their shared life inhabited. She turned as he entered, and her eyes, those deep, perceptive eyes that could see straight through to the core of him, searched his face. She didn't speak. She simply waited, creating a space of such immense and terrible patience that Will felt his carefully constructed resolve begin to crumble. He wanted to fall to his knees then and there, to beg for a forgiveness he knew he could not and should not receive, but the words stuck in his throat, glued there by shame. Instead, he crossed the room slowly, each step an eternity, until he stood before her. The Persian rug was soft and intricate beneath his feet, a masterpiece of craftsmanship that suddenly seemed to represent the complex, beautiful life they had built together, a life he had set ablaze. He looked at her, truly looked at her, taking in the familiar curve of her cheek, the slight worry line between her brows that he had sworn to smooth away forever, the quiet dignity in her posture. This was Electra. His Electra. The woman who had believed in him when he was a man of nothing, who had seen a future for him when he could see only a past of failures. She was his harbor and his compass, and he had deliberately, recklessly, sailed into a storm, smashing the vessel of their trust on the rocks of his own weakness. The magnitude of his failure was an ocean threatening to drown him. His breath hitched, a ragged, broken sound in the quiet room. He could bear the weight of his own guilt, but he could not bear the sight of her standing there, innocent and unknowing, about to be annihilated by the truth he carried. His knees gave way, not as a theatrical gesture, but as a complete physical capitulation to the enormity of what he had done. He knelt on the rug before her, the position one of utter supplication and defeat, his head bowed so low his forehead nearly touched the floor. And then it began, a torrent of words, choked and raw, spilling out of him like blood from a fatal wound. He confessed everything. He did not look up, he could not bear to see the light in her eyes extinguish. He spoke to the intricate patterns of the rug, his voice a low, desperate monotone. He started from the beginning, from the moment at the gala when a seemingly innocuous conversation had taken a dangerous turn, a turn he had recognized and yet done nothing to correct. He confessed to the thrill of the attention, the seductive novelty of being listened to by a new person, the way he had allowed himself to feel interesting and separate from the entity of Will and Electra. He did not spare himself. He detailed his own rationalizations, the pathetic internal whispers that it was harmless, that he was in control, that it was just a conversation. He confessed to the decision to leave the gala separately, to the calculated lie about helping a friend with a crisis. He described the taxi ride across town, a journey during which he had felt both electrified and numb, a passenger in his own body, watching a stranger make a series of catastrophic decisions. And then, the core of it, the central, unforgivable fact. I slept with a woman that night. The words hung in the air between them, no longer a silent scream in his own head but a spoken reality, a black hole that now sucked all the light and warmth from the room. He forced himself to continue, to offer up every damning detail, not to cause her more pain, but because he owed her the entire, unvarnished truth. He described the crushing emptiness that had followed almost immediately, the visceral, physical sickness that had overtaken him even before he had left the anonymous hotel room, a self-loathing so profound it had left him shaking on the sidewalk, vomiting into a gutter, wishing for a bus to jump in front of or a cliff to throw himself from. He told her of the interminable, hellish walk home, each step a mile, each second a year, the weight of what he had done settling on his shoulders with the physical density of stone. He confessed his cowardice in the taxi back to their neighborhood, his hope that she would already be asleep, his desperate, fleeting desire to maybe, just maybe, hide this cancer and let it consume only him. But he told her he knew, even then, that he could not. He spoke until his voice was hoarse and cracked, until there was nothing left in him, no secret withheld, no mitigating circumstance invented. He offered it all to her, every shattered piece of his betrayal, and then he fell silent, utterly spent, broken and empty, kneeling at the feet of the woman he had devastated, waiting for the sentence he knew he deserved. The silence that followed his confession was more profound than any that had come before. It was a living, breathing entity. It was the silence of a world ended. He could hear the soft crackle of the dying fire, the distant hum of the city, the frantic, hammering beat of his own heart. He dared not move, dared not breathe. He felt a single, scalding tear trace a path down his cheek and fall onto the back of his hand, followed by another. He was crying silently, hopelessly. He waited for her to speak, for the cry of anguish, the roar of fury, the cold, dismissive command to get out and never return. He waited for the sound of something shattering, a glass, a vase, their lives. But for a long, agonizing time, there was nothing. Then, he heard a soft, sharp intake of breath, a sound like someone surfacing from deep water, gasping for air they weren't sure they wanted. He felt, rather than saw, her move. She didn't step back. She didn't strike him. She simply stood there, above him, a statue of grief and shock, absorbing the cataclysm. And in that endless, silent moment, suspended between the confession and the consequence, Will understood that some acts are not mistakes. They are choices. And some choices create a before and an after, and he was now, and would forever be, living in the hollow, desolate after.